Okay, this presentation is on John Milton and Paradise Lost. John Milton being sort of the titan of 17th century poetry. If there's a Mount Rushmore of British poets, it would have Chaucer, Shakespeare, and John Milton, and I suppose I'd put William Blake or William Wordsworth up there too. We're not going to be reading them in this class, however. So Milton was born in London in 1608, not far from St. Paul's Cathedral, where John Donne would be appointed dean when Milton was around 13 years old. His father was a scrivener, very successful scrivener. So he was basically a document writer in the world of finance in London. Was quite successful at it, preparing contracts and that sort of thing. His wife was Sarah Jeffrey. When Milton was a boy, he was tutored by a Scottish man named Thomas Young, who was Presbyterian. He had a pretty significant impact on young Milton. Even though Milton's father was Church of England, Thomas Young was Presbyterian, so he was getting exposed early on to dissenting religious ideas. He was educated, Milton was, at a very prestigious school in London, St. Paul's School, and developed there an aptitude for languages, Greek and Latin specifically, which would carry over to his career, his academic career at Cambridge, where he is from 1625 to 1632 at Cambridge. And he was preparing initially for a career in the Church of England. But while he was there, Charles I appointed Archbishop William Laud, whose reforms of the Anglican Church, sort of turning it back more towards old church, old Catholic ritual forms and so forth, turned him towards nonconformism. So falling back on the example of his tutor, his Presbyterian tutor, Thomas Young. His first published poem, Milton's first published poem, appeared in the second folio of Shakespeare in 1632. This was a new version of the first folio, which had appeared in 1623, and basically a lot of updated spelling and so forth for the second folio of 1632. And Milton contributed a poem, an epitaph on Shakespeare, that appeared in the front matter of that book. So this was his first published poem. He went back home after Cambridge and spent several years in quiet, independent study at home with his family, reading books. He read voraciously. He read everything he could get his hands on. If you read Paradise Lost, it's just his knowledge of things is encyclopedic. He knows about science. He's studied theology and philosophy, and he's read all of the classics and the Bible, studied all these things very closely, and that certainly comes out in Paradise Lost. And a lot of that reading he did during this period of quiet, independent study at home. In fact, later in life, he attributed his loss of eyesight to all this intensive study that he did, staying up all night, reading by candlelight, and so forth. He traveled to France and Italy in 1638 and learned, he sort of honed his linguistic skills there, and socialized with prominent European intellectuals, the astronomer Galileo, who at this point was living under house arrest in Florence for his proposals about the structure of the universe. Got him in a lot of trouble with the Catholic Church. Galileo is actually mentioned in Book 1 of Paradise Lost. In 1638, he publishes his first major poem, Lycidas, which is a pastoral elegy. It was An elegy is a poem written. It's a poem of lamentation written about the death of a friend or companion or close associate, and it's written in the form of pastoral poetry. And this was published in 1638. The name of the classmate of his at Cambridge who died was Edward King, and this was published in a memorial volume dedicated to Edward King in 1638. In 1642, he gets married. He's in his early 30s at this point and marries a 17-year-old. Her name was Mary Powell, and they did not get along. They were intellectually incompatible. This was the year of the Revolution, 1642, and her family was royalist, and Milton definitely had leaned parliamentarian, more puritanical. So she left. She went home after just a few months of marriage, and during this period, Milton writes a series of controversial divorce tracts. Controversial because he was defending divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences, as we would call them today. And the parliamentarian government had issued a press ordinance in 1643 that this involved the licensing of pamphlets, and Milton felt that this was oppressive, and so he wrote one of his most famous prose tracts, Areopagitica, and this was a defense of free press. And a foundational document in the concept of freedom of expression and free press. In 1645, he's reconciled with his wife, Mary Powell. She'll go on to bear him 4 children before dying in childbirth in 1652. They only have one son. His name was John, and he did not survive childhood. So all of his surviving children were daughters. In 1645, he publishes poems, which you see here on the right, not a very flattering portrait of John Milton, but this collection included most of his early poetry. It included L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, and On the Morning of Christ's Nativity, some important early poems, some of them dating back to his Cambridge days. This is a later sort of imagined portrait. This is an 18th century painting by a portrait painter named George Robney, and shows Milton there on the right looking morose. He's blind by this point, so he was dictating Paradise Lost to his amanuenses, who would have been his daughters, and you can see them there on the left looking sort of cowering almost as they do the work of transcription for their father. In 1649, he becomes secretary and foreign diplomat for the Commonwealth. Basically, he was involved in preparing documents, writing them in Latin, and delivering messages from the Commonwealth to various European powers. He would continue in this role during Cromwell's protectorate for a time. He helped Marvel get the post of Latin secretary. He also publishes his tract Tenure of Kings and Magistrates in this year, which was a defense, essentially. It's implicit, but it's a defense of the regicide, the beheading of Charles I a year earlier, and basically outlines the tenets of republican government. So an important tract. In 1652, the same year that Mary Powell dies, giving birth to one of their children, he loses his eyesight completely, now completely blind. He wrote, he would later write a couple of sonnets on this experience. When I consider how my light is spent, being one, and Methought I Saw My Late Espoused Saint is the other, which is about his other wife, whom we'll talk about, Catherine Woodcock. We'll talk about her in just a moment. There she is, 1656, marries Catherine Woodcock. She dies just a couple years later after giving birth to a daughter. That daughter also died, unfortunately. And again, she's the subject of his poem, Methought I Saw My Late Espoused Saint. She's the saint. In 1660, Charles II is restored to the throne, but Milton continues as a staunch defender of political and religious liberty. He had just published more tracts, basically defending the revolutionary government, the parliamentarian government, and he is eventually caught. But Andrew Marvell, who was a little more diplomatic and accepted the restoration, manages to negotiate a pardon, and Milton is released from prison. In 1663, he married for the third time. Her name was Elizabeth Mensall. In 1667, in the aftermath of the Great Plague and Fire of London, the Great Plague and the fire, the Great Plague wiped out a large portion of the city's population, including a lot of booksellers and book printers. And then the Fire of London was also devastating for the publication industry because printing presses and printing houses burned down in the fire, and there was a paper shortage. So very difficult time to get something published. But in 1667, a man named Samuel Simmons publishes the 10-book version of Paradise Lost, which we'll talk more about in just a moment. In 1671, he publishes his last long works, Paradise Regained, which is also in blank verse like Paradise Lost. It's in 4 books and basically tells the story of the temptation of Christ that's in the Gospel of Luke. And then with it, he published Samson Agonistes, which tells the story of Samson and Delilah, which is in the book of Judges, an Old Testament story. And he tells it in the form of Greek tragedy, so long declamatory speeches in Samson Agonistes. In 1674, the second edition of Paradise Lost is published, again by Samuel Simmons, this time in 12 books, and he died the following fall, 1674. So let's talk a little bit about Paradise Lost, just the publication history. Here's the title page for the 1667 edition, and as you can see, it's written in 10 books by John Milton. The 1667 edition had only 10. For the second edition of 1674, Milton would split books 7 and 10 in 2, which would bring the total number of books to 12. This early edition also lacked the short preface defending Milton's use of blank verse, his versification, and it also did not have the prose arguments or the little summaries at the head of each book. These additions were at the insistence of his publisher, Samuel Simmons. And I find the preface on versification interesting because he defends the use of unrhymed blank verse. By the mid-17th century, blank verse had gone out of fashion, so to speak, and most poetry rhymed. The poems of Herrick and Marvell, for example, typically rhyme. And so he was defending the use of blank verse. And in his defense, I find it particularly interesting that he uses revolutionary language to talk about blank verse. The very last sentence of the preface, he says that his poem is to be esteemed an example set, the first in English, of ancient liberty recovered to heroic poem from the troublesome and modern bondage of rhyming. So the bondage of rhyming and the liberty of blank verse. I find that language intriguing. So here is the title page for the 12th book, Paradise Lost, looks very similar. Identified now as the second edition and in 12 books. And one other curious feature of this title page is that it shows the publisher, Samuel Simmons. If you look at the title page on the left, we do not see the publisher's name at the bottom. It's just the booksellers who were selling the book when they were delivered from the printer. I don't know why. I don't know if anyone does. One could speculate. I think that John Milton was still controversial, maybe in the mid 1660s, as a former radical. Maybe Samuel Simmons wanted to distance himself a little bit from that. I'm not sure. I'm just speculating here. But certainly by 1674, the poem is quite popular. Charles II has a copy of it, and Simmons feels pretty comfortable putting his name on the title page this time in 1674. So what I'm going to do now is give just a general overview of the architecture of Paradise Lost. We're not reading the whole thing in this class, so just to kind of put the books we are reading into some context, book 1, and these are just very, very short summaries. By no means are these little snippets I give you here meant to describe everything that happens in the books. They're just the big points. So in book 1, Satan rouses his legions in hell, and we get the construction of their fortress, Pandemonium. In book 2, the Council of Devils, the Stygian Council, they convene to discuss what to do. How are we going to get revenge for what's happened to us? Eventually, they decide that Satan should go down to the Garden of Eden and try to wreck things, and he begins that journey in book 2. In book 3, the action shifts to heaven, where God foresees the fall of Adam and Eve, and he explains all this to his son, Jesus Christ, who offers to sacrifice himself to redeem humanity. And then in book 4, we go back to Satan, who arrives now in Eden. We get a description of the garden, and we get our first long look at Adam and Eve and how they live. Book 5, the archangel Raphael comes and lectures Adam on free will and cautions him against evil. Free will is a major theme of Paradise Lost. Do we get to choose our destiny, or is it already chosen for us? In book 6, Raphael continues his discourse with Adam. He had ended book 5 talking a little bit about Satan getting his rebels together, and in book 6 we get a description of all-out war. It's a pretty exciting book. It's epic poetry. It's full of large-scale battles, and this is Milton's homage to the battles of the Iliad by Homer. And it ends with the expulsion of the rebel angels, and that gets picked back up in book 1 when they wake up in hell. In book 7, Raphael continues. He tells Adam about the creation of the world in 6 days. And this is one of the books that was split. And in book 8, Adam tells about his own creation, and we get the story of the creation of Eve. And then in book 9, we pick back up where book 4 left off. Adam and Eve have an argument about how to divide the work, how their work should be done. The serpent tempts Eve, and then Adam eventually chooses to eat the fruit as well, and so they both fall in book 9. In book 10, Adam and Eve become aware of this. They become conscious of what they've done. They bicker about it at the end of book 9, and then they really bewail their state in book 10. Sin and death enter the world. Sin and death, whom Satan had encountered back in Book 2. And Satan and his legions are punished in hell. Satan goes back and he's proud of what he's done, but then they are punished and turned into snakes. In Book 11, Adam and Eve repent, but they are sentenced to banishment. They may not stay in Eden. And Michael comes to tell Adam this, and also tells him what is going to come in the future. In Book 12, Michael eventually tells Adam of the coming of Christ and their eventual redemption. And then the poem ends with Adam and Eve banished from Eden. They are escorted out. And that's how the poem ends. Now, we're only looking at 4, book 1, Book 2, Book 4, and Book 9. But taken together, they do form a continuous narrative where we start in hell, and then Satan journeys to paradise, and then once there, he finds Adam and Eve and then tempts them, and they eat the fruit and they fall. So it forms, these 4 books form a continuous narrative, but we're only reading a third of the total. So let's talk a little bit about the epic tradition. Paradise Lost is an epic poem, and it will have many of the features that we discussed earlier, features of epic poetry. We talked about some of these features when we read Beowulf and the Fairy Queen. Of course, the most obvious feature of epic poetry is it's a long narrative, and if it's modeled on classical forms, it's divided into an even number of books. And when Milton split Paradise Lost from when he split books 7 and 10, he gave it 12 books, which is the same number of books contained in Virgil's The Aeneid, which is one of the great classical epics. The subject matter is grand. It's grand action, grand historical themes, larger than life characters. Oftentimes supernatural figures are involved, the gods in classical poetry, and certainly the devils and angels in Paradise Lost. There will be an invocation of the muse. Remember, epic poets identify their subject and then have a kind of prayer to the gods of poetry to come speak to them. It's a way of giving a kind of artistic and historical legitimacy to their work, that I'm not making this up. This comes to me from, I'm inspired by some being that has higher knowledge. And I'm the speaking vessel for this. Ataxis or long catalogs or lists of objects, persons, or places. You can look for all of these in the first 2 books of Paradise Lost. Extended metaphors. Milton loves them. They usually start with a transitional phrase like as when. So whenever you see that phrase as when, get ready for a 10, 15, or 20 line digression. But what Milton is doing is creating these elaborate comparisons to kind of add texture, thematically, tonally, to the narrative that he's telling. And finally, the catabasis, the journey to the underworld. This is a feature of the Odyssey and the Aeneid. And this was kind of interesting to think, what qualifies as the journey to the underworld here, since the poem Paradise Lost, since it starts in the underworld. Is the journey to Eden the journey to the underworld? Kind of an interesting question to think about. But this kind of long journey is certainly a feature of epic poetry. Aeneas in the Aeneid and Odysseus in the Odyssey go on these journeys, and both of them travel to the underworld, where they get information about their respective destinies. The first 2 books of Paradise Lost are concerned primarily with the goings-on in hell. The second 2 that we're reading, books 4 and 9, take place in the more domestic world of Adam and Eve. And there are some questions for you to think about. We can discuss these in class. What surprises you about Milton's version of the story of Adam and Eve? What does his version of that story reveal about his beliefs about husband-wife relations, and in particular sexual relations? It's an important aspect of his treatment of Adam and Eve. And then what factors contribute to Satan's successful temptation of Eve? That's primarily in Book 9. And then how much blame for the fall should be placed on Adam. So think about these questions as you're reading books 4 and 9, and we will talk about them in class, the questions in class. And that concludes this presentation on John Milton and Paradise Lost.